Okay, good morning and welcome everyone to the second edition of the Africa-India Global Dialogue. My name is Pamela Gopor from the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, based in South Africa. And we are jointly hosting this series today with the Center of Social and Economic Progress, a think tank based in New Delhi. CSEP is an independent public policy think tank that conducts in-depth research and provides evidence-based recommendations on critical issues facing India and the world. CSEP's work spans on various domains, including economic growth, finance, health, energy, sustainability, and foreign policy, aiming to shape policies and promote sustainable development. While on the African Union Development Agency, the Policy Bridge Tank, the program that I represent, is dedicated to engaging and leveraging the knowledge generated by think tanks to address continental and regional challenges through evidence-based policy and knowledge services. Our main objective is to translate this research outputs into actionable insights, connecting knowledge to decision-making platforms, and to build a robust, connected, African-driven science research and policy space. So this series will culminate into a knowledge product that will translate your contributions in shaping a more promising world order through our experiences as well as our voices. India and Africa are leveraging tech solutions and policies to drive inclusive growth. In India, initiatives like the Digital India enhance digital infrastructure and promote e-governance, while ensuring that technology benefits reach all societal segments. While in Africa, digital transformation is guided by frameworks like the African Digital Compact and the Continental African Artificial Intelligence Strategy, aiming to boost economic growth and societal well-being. That focuses on enhancing digital technologies to improve the economic growth and social well-being, as well as sustainable development in alignment with the African Union Agenda 2063 goals and aspirations. Both the regions prioritize digital inclusion to create a more equitable and prosperous future, to ensure that these technological advancements benefit all segments of society. So once again, I do welcome you all to this conversation on the pertinent topic of developing digital futures tech solutions and policies for inclusive growth from both the India and Africa perspective. And I do encourage you to please post your questions on the chat function to facilitate a robust discussion. With that, I am now honored to introduce to you Dr. Veda, a Senior Research Fellow at CSEP, to take the discussions forward. Over to you, Veda. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. As Pamela mentioned, I'm an Associate Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. And let me just quickly give you a sense of what we had in mind when we chose this theme for this episode. Essentially, it was two broad components that we wanted to try and unpack. One was to understand the role of locally grown tech innovations as drivers of economic and social growth in India and much of Africa, and also to try and imagine if we could identify opportunities where these tech ecosystems could interact and possibly even collaborate with each other. The second component was an imagination of digital futures and what it would mean to craft inclusive policies, and to try and even define and unpack what this inclusive would mean. So to do this, we have Dr. Karthik Shastri from Princeton. We have Priya Chetty from Research ICT Africa. And I'm not going to tell you about their impressive resumes because Mahao is going to put them out in the chat box. But what we will do is first we'll listen to them and sort of hear them out, listen to their opening remarks about their initial thoughts on the subject. And then we'll go into a moderated conversation where you can please, like Pamela mentioned, have your questions in the chat box, and we'll try and take as many as possible. So Karthik, would you like to kick us off?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for thinking to include me in this dialogue. And I'm very excited to discuss more and to take some questions as well. So, as Veda mentioned, I am an academic economist, and a lot of my research is about what determines the focus and the intensity of scientific and technological research around the world, and whether that does or does not translate into inclusive growth. So just to give a concrete example, which illustrates some of the findings of my research, one topic that I've studied in some detail is the topic of agricultural innovation through the world, which is of sort of utmost importance to economic development and of great historical interest to governments and intergovernmental organizations as well. In a study with a colleague, Jacob Moscona of MIT, we studied the determinants of a phenomenon that we call technology mismatch. And in a nutshell, that's the idea that the technologies that are developed in the status quo, most of which are being developed in high-income countries that invest very much in R&D, aren't necessarily the ones that are appropriate and lead to inclusive growth in the rest of the world. One example that we lead off the study with is take corn. Corn is grown everywhere in the world. In the United States, there's a specific pest that affects corn called the corn rootworm that the people in the industry call the quote billion-dollar bug. And that's precisely because that's the numerical amount of damage it used to do to corn growth in the 1990s in the United States. And it was also the bounty or the prize for biotech companies to develop effective solutions that would allow you to grow corn in spite of this persistent pest. And that billion-dollar number has gone steadily down and down and down over time. What's going on in the rest of the world? Well, in sub-Saharan Africa, what decimates corn production is not that specific insect. It's the maize stalk borer, which decimates corn production. To use some examples, in Kenya and South Africa, there's numerous studies about this. But if you look out into the world, how many biotechnology patents take out in the US are explicitly about building resistance to the maize stalk borer? It's an order of magnitude less. And what we show in our study is that this is a very pervasive and systematic phenomenon. It seems to depress the diffusion of technology between countries, and it seems to lead to productivity differences between countries. And we discuss even more kind of what seems to be leading to this. Well, some of it is just the inherent inequality in the world we start with. Some of it is also intellectual property law and the systems that encourage or discourage innovation in different parts of the world. So that is, a potentially distressing and not so encouraging view of the status quo. But what can policy do about this is sort of another topic that we've tried to address in our research. And the answer seems to be that targeted investments in research and development, and again, our focus has been the agricultural sector, can do a lot in order to reverse this trend. And we've studied, for example, case studies of agricultural research investments in Brazil by the Brazilian government is sort of one topic that's been of sort of great interest to us, as well as agricultural research investments by NGOs during the Green Revolution in the mid-20th century. Those seem to be, in the data, the kinds of investments that do lead to more inclusive technology. And it's a silver lining that builds on the same idea that technology development seems to be very localized, and in that sense, there's no substitute. If the goal is inclusive technology, there's no substitute for local investments.
Thank you, Karthik. Priya?
Thanks so much, Veda, and thank you again to AUDA-NEPAD and others for the opportunity to be on this platform. It's such an interesting time to also be having this conversation, I feel. So let me first introduce myself. I am incoming Executive Director at Research ICT Africa and lead teams based in Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Cape Town. And we are eternally obsessed with the digital policy agenda and questions for research on the digital policy agenda that is arising, which is why I think I have this high interest in this conversation today, because I feel like we're in this crucial time where we have access to knowledge about how the digital economy is playing out and the data economy is playing out and some of the effects that we're seeing. But we're also in uncharted territory as we see advanced technologies becoming more and more prominent. And so for us, the questions become, how can we leverage the insights that we have and the evidence that we have to be able to prepare us for the future so that our governance and our institutions stand up down the line? So to give you some examples of some of the work that I'm involved in, our programmatic work is across a few themes: information integrity, data governance, digital inclusion, and equitable and inclusive artificial intelligence. So some of the questions that bug us is, what is data governance? What is responsible data governance going to look like now and into the future? And for that, it means, how do we transition from some of the regulatory frameworks that we have? We like to think of ourselves as regulatory innovators in that way, because it is uncharted territory. So if we've got data protection frameworks, do they allow the kind of autonomy and agency of the data as the technology progresses? And what can we do to improve the legislative environment to allow for that? So if we want people, humans, across the world to have more agency and autonomy and decision-making powers, then what do we do? If we think that there are opportunities for access to be able to participate and thrive in AI innovation, then do the innovation policy frameworks that we have and do the AI policy frameworks that we have and the access to data frameworks that we have allow us to participate and innovate in the way that we do? And what are the frustrations that are being experienced by Africans in that context? So some glimpses is that we have some of the structural barriers on the access side, on the inclusion side, that remain. So we've got high costs, for instance, and prohibitive costs when it comes to data, access to devices. We've got groups in society that continue to be marginalized while others seem to have better access and continue to thrive. And at the same time, when we look at advanced technologies, I think the questions are changing, because now, to Karthik's point about innovation and the potential that we're seeing, now the questions transition to, how do we allow our citizens, our African citizens, to be able to thrive in this context? Do we have everything we need to be able to innovate productively and to influence our development pathway? If we were going to be a part of it and have agency in that process, do our policy and regulatory frameworks allow us to do so? Yeah.
Thank you. Now, because both of you mentioned the potential for innovation, I was thinking if we could just scale this conversation back a little bit. And I was sort of bundling what you just said with existing literature, a lot of new emerging literature, even from the continent, that talk about how important it is to adapt these homegrown digital technologies and their role in perhaps leapfrogging development. So in this sort of context, what policy interventions do you think would be effective for fostering local technology development in the first place? Like, how do we get more of these innovations to come out? How do we, like you put it, make them, mainstream them into our policy pathways? Either of you can take this question first.
Well, I think, oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Karthik. I'll be brief. And I think, Veda, to your question, there is a kind of looking at the cupboard in terms of what we have already in our telecommunications regulation, longstanding telecommunications regulation, competition regulation, and looking at the way we regulate data, for instance. So, for instance, in our communications regulation, we have this concept about universal access and universal service. And I think one of the questions we're asking today is, these funds and these facilities that we've created, to broaden digital inclusion, can they be reimagined? And if they were to reprioritize, then how would they? So, do they place increased priority on those that experience, a kind of geographical divide? And so, is there more priority placed on those who are residing in rural areas? How are some of these effects playing out for young people, and what is their trajectory for work in the digital economy, and can there be some intervention there? So can these funds be reprioritized? On the competition side, are we seeing market entry barriers for our innovators? And if we diagnose that, then how can we respond to those challenges? And I think there are a few options that are being put on the table. On the data side, I think there's a real opportunity for data representation. And so there's something there about, if we are going to get a very real solution that's going to address a very real challenge in our development context, then do we have the data that we need? And do we need to grow the data representation? And at the same time, if we do have this good data sitting somewhere that can be leveraged, then do we have the mechanisms to access that data? And so I think those are the exciting questions of our time, with a number of solutions on the table, and we're working through those. And just to say that they can never be a perfect solution or one that could suit all geographies and all countries, but that's the kind of option set that we're dealing with, trying to navigate what exists, and at the same time counter some negative effects that we're seeing by introducing safety regulation and safety policies, and so building our resilience to some of the harms that may present as we bring more and more people online and with access to advanced technologies.
Thank you, Priya. I do have a few follow-up questions, but I'm going to let Karthik go first.
Sure, and I'll only add a little bit to that fabulous answer that Priya gave. And my instinct as an academic is to ask, well, to what extent is the past precedent, does that give us clues about what these investments can look like? And those investments happen, the low-income countries of the past in which those investments happen are the high-income countries of today, right? So take the United States. How did the United States reach a level at which it produces a lot of technology? Almost the definition of frontier technology is what's local to the interests here. Well, 100, 150 years ago, it was through very massive investments in public R&D, both at the beginning of the century with the establishment of a university system in the United States through a tremendous amount of federal investment. And then in the mid-20th century, after World War II, with another enormous wave to create the National Science Foundation, to create institutions that support science and technology development. So I think, one of the big open questions, to what extent does that translate into the world we live in now? Of course, it's a little bit different. And the nature of digital entrepreneurship and digital technologies, exactly how they're created, exactly how you create markets for them, is a little bit different. But one thing that I do think needs to be in the conversation, it's not an immediate solution that will solve the problem overnight, but the long run solution probably has a lot to do with investing in higher education and using the resources of the state in order to encourage more science and technology broadly as sort of the seedbed for promoting innovation and new companies in very specific areas.
Thank you, Karthik. And that sort of is a good segue to the other question I had, this idea of investing in higher education, the idea of capacity building and so on. A lot of the literature is also talking about how Africa's digital landscape is attracting a lot of other global rising and new powers to it. There's so much opportunity and scalability and all of that, right? For instance, recently the US, they had a digital transformation with Africa program. China, of course, had the digital Silk Road and so on. And Folashade Sule recently came out with a report about how African governments are navigating these complex digital partnerships. So in this sort of as if the conversation wasn't complex enough, if I had to add another variable to this, right? And if you had to advise Indian tech entrepreneurs who were looking to foray into African ecosystems, or even questions on the feasibility of deploying the India stack or India's digital public infrastructure models to Africa, what would your sense be about those things? Karthik?
It's a fantastic set of questions, and it's very much on the mind because thinking about the development of the India stack technology and its diffusion to other countries in the global south is another research project that I've been trying to get off the ground recently with some of my colleagues. I think there's no, as you said, there's no simple solution to this. I think what I would keep in mind is whether the kind of technologies that were developed for the India stack, keeping in mind a very specific ecosystem of policies in India, right? Partnership with the government for digital ID, the way that that's used to kind of allocate social services in India, et cetera. I would think a lot about whether that's immediately applicable to the context of other countries, especially in Africa, and kind of what partnerships with the state are necessary in order to make it applicable and to make those technologies inherently valuable, right? Because in a vacuum, just sort of taking, the app that was developed in India for a specific purpose and kind of throwing it in a new market may not necessarily add up to anything because those were created for a very, very precise purpose. And I mean that as a optimistic take that with careful consideration and sort of thoughtful adaptation, these technologies could make a big difference, actually. So I think that's what comes to my mind.
Thank you. I'm going to come back and ask you a follow-up question on that. But Priya.
Yeah, that's so interesting to be in the mind of the Indian innovator, and I wonder, the lessons that they already have, just in terms of where we're at with digital transformation and what got us here. So we've seen this kind of evolution from concepts like e-government to where we are with digital public infrastructure, and we know, I suppose, what the foundations are of digital public infrastructure. So it's a question as to where the opportunities may be. And I think there will be lots of parallels from the Indian experience into the continental experience. And the one is this conundrum that we find ourselves in, where we want to have efficient governance, but we're not entirely obsessed with just efficient governance. We also want ways in which we can provide for value creation for the public. And so when we implement, digital identity and digital payments, and when we are able to access the infrastructure and leverage the infrastructure, then how do we do that in a way in which we don't just prioritize government, but we also prioritize the whole of society having access to this infrastructure? So transformation should be reinterpreted. And in doing so, I think there will be amazing parallels between the Indian experience and the continental experience. We face similar challenges, and so the challenges will resonate, but the opportunity will also resonate. And so, to do that kind of needs analysis on both sides of the equation, one in terms of the efficiency of public governance, and on the other hand, how we create the opportunity for impact and access to opportunity across society. Yeah.
Priya, if I could just follow up on that. You're a technology lawyer. You've spent decades helping craft these regulations for governments and so on. So in this, the word that you mentioned, the transformation, reinterpreting transformation, right? And this question of digital divide, which is, this is a part of the conversation in India and across countries in Africa. What do we mean by inclusive policies, right? Who are the people that are being left behind? How can policymakers actively address these people and make sure that they are sort of carried along in this process?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there are many interpretations to this, and I want to think about the interpretation that that the ordinary citizen would have, and they will ask questions about what does this mean for me, and how do I, what is really the value add for me? And so I think in the way that we consider our regulation and our policy, we have to ask ourselves whether we are creating opportunity just for participation or for thriving, in economic terms and in social terms, in terms of our ambitions there, and whether this technology can be leveraged for that purpose. And this translates in various ways. And we have to look, for instance, at the intellectual property regulation and see whether there's something prohibitive in that. And so whether the structure of this allows only few people to participate and commercially benefit, and whether there are something that's inhibiting an intellectual property environment. If this structural barrier has traditionally been around access to data, then, and I keep coming back to it because I feel as if it's the big challenge of our time. And if we can unlock this and make the data accessible, usable in meaningful terms, meaning that, the data has the capability from the start to be used by anyone. And that raises questions around language, and perhaps some cultural elements as well, in terms of what creates this ecosystem where there's participation and thriving in a digital economy and a data economy. And that's the questions that we really need to focus on if we're thinking about inclusivity. And at the same time, I think not to get too locked into specific challenge statements, but also think more broadly about, as the technology advances, will it create new divides, and will groups be further impacted negatively by what they're experiencing as access, and how do we counter that? So for me, I prioritize young people as a group, because so much of our potential and our ability to thrive as a continent is going to depend on their access to the digital economy and to the data economy. So for this group, how do we characterize them, their experience, and what they're looking for? And can we use policy and regulation to give them access to what they need, whether it's intellectual goods, whether it's data, whether it is an opportunity to innovate as needed.
Thank you, Priya. I think you touched upon a lot of really important things, each of which we can spend an hour unpacking. Karthik, did you want to come in?
I don't have too much to add, but I think, something that I think is important and maybe intrinsic to digital technologies is that inclusivity is a very positive sum outcome, because if you have a more inclusive platform, more people are using it. A lot of digital technologies benefit from the social component. Payments are obviously intrinsically more useful, mobile payments, and more people are using it, and you create a network of trust and acceptance and access. And then that sort of feeds back to data for app creators as well. And technology creators, right? Because if you have information on how more people are using the app and how to better suit them, you can develop new technologies in the future. So I think that's a sort of a very uncontroversial goal, both from a social perspective and a private perspective. And as economists, we're always looking out for those opportunities where interests align in ways like that.
I just want to quickly come in and remind the participants that they can use the raise hand feature at this point if they had any questions, and I'll call on you and you can ask your question. We're going to try and make it as interactive as possible. Or if you don't want to talk, please use the chat button as well. Pamela, I wanted to also make sure that I wasn't completely stealing all of the attention. Did you have a question at this point?
Well, thank you, Veda. I think I'm a little bit of a realist, and I'm listening, and it was really, really interesting to even hear about the $1 billion bug from Karthik. But what I'm thinking, and I'm trying to be as realistic as possible, often our ambitions or the failure for the ambitions are really doesn't go hand in hand with what is actually delivered on the ground. And I think as economists or as academics, as researchers, How do we enter this level? When is data sufficient enough to turn into a policy, to turn into actionable? And in the Priya space, yes, youth, there might be excellent users, but I don't think they have any idea of how the usage, the data at their level can actually translate into a policy level. Now we have many platforms, and this platform is one of it, to engage in this discussion and to see how we can actually be able to shape and inform this policy. But what do you think is one of the fundamental reasons why the failure for ambitions doesn't go hand in hand with the delivery process of what we're doing in our respective, leave alone the world, leave alone our continent or the regions that we operate in, but in our respective professionals, what would you like to see in this domain? Thank you.
Karthik, do you want to take that one first?
It's a big question and an absolutely essential question. I think, one thing that, and again, we have to be careful here about exactly what lessons to the past do and don't translate into the digital world and the world of data that Pamela was alluding to. I think I think a lot about the role of the state as a promoter of research and development and innovation and technology development. And in history, what are the conditions under which investments in research and new technology were durable, serious investments that lasted more than one generation, compared to kind of transitory investments that were used to kind of make the case that particular government or regime is interested in the long run, but weren't serious in the way that they have to be in order to make a difference. And what I see in historical examples is that a huge element here is kind of whether you can create collaboration between research institutions and other existing institutions like universities and institutions of higher learning. And the second is whether you can create trying to think of the right phrase for this. You give participants skin in the game, where sort of they have a stake personally in the future of research output and what they produce. To go back to sort of one of the examples from my own research, a case study that we have studied quite a bit is agricultural research in Brazil. Now, agricultural research institutions are ubiquitous throughout the world. There's not a country in the world probably that's not trying to make a serious investment in crop breeding, extension, and kind of all of these classic things that are suspected to, in the long run, increase agricultural productivity. Brazil's investment in their National Agricultural Corporation, Embrapa, has been by most margins, and by our quantitative analysis as well, one of the most wildly successful in the world. That country went from food insecurity in the 1970s to one of the world's largest agricultural exports. And it's largely credited that the reason that country is so agriculturally productive and sort of the first wave technology investments that made the current technology development so potent. We're creating agricultural research stations in what were at times considered very remote areas of the country, areas that didn't see a lot of research and development. There's wonderful and interesting anecdotes about the first research stations in the Amazon, where it was understood that basically there was not a single human being with a PhD in agricultural sciences that lived in that part of the country, before the government said that it was necessary as a social national priority to take seriously doing research and development in that area and trying to include the interests of that region in sort of the national R&D agenda. I think two things that seem very important about that investment, and again, if they translate or not, is going to depend on some details. Is one is that it was very geographically distributed, that it was inherently considered important to not create an agricultural research corporation that just rounds together people who are already in Sao Paulo, kind of the richest and most research-intensive part of the country, and put them in one big tall tower where they think hard about the problems and conditions that are happening in the country. It was kind of obvious to the organizers and the creators of Embrapa that no, you have to put researchers where they belong, where they can interact with local communities, actually learn what are the challenges that people are facing and do something about them. And the second is that it was set up as a corporation. I think that is sort of a bold and I suspect underappreciated aspect of things. That it was state funded, but it was able to market products. It was profitable inherently, so it wasn't entirely. And of course that has costs and benefits. It might result in the short run in higher cost products being produced by that R&D initiative, but my suspicion is that in the long run, it created more incentives and more buy-in for people who worked there, right? That were motivated by the social mission, but also able to treat this as a sort of serious career trajectory and a serious job so they could keep top talent through that mechanism. So those are the ideas that come to mind about what sort of differentiates serious R&D investments from more transitory R&D investments in the past. And of course, this is all easier said than done, but I do think there's some lessons from what we have seen in recent history.
But Karthik, just quickly, beyond the state and beyond governments, have there been examples where industry has taken a step in to sort of fuel innovation and capacity building?
Absolutely. And you could argue, especially in advanced economies, that's kind of the default that innovation and R&D is kind of at a level where it's very self-perpetuating because of the incentives that are created, et cetera. But I do want to maybe not completely overstate this case, but come on pretty strong that especially at early levels of development, when you look at countries like the United States that used to be at an early level of development and are not anymore, it's hard. I think it's hard to overstate the role of public investments in catalyzing R&D, kind of at all levels. First in the conversation we had earlier about research and development, and kind of second through these more heavy-handed interventions, creating national research institutes. And the reason is that our R&D and technology development is a difficult thing to jumpstart because it has so many interlocking pieces, right? The orthodox economics answer about how to get the private sector to do this is to create markets. Well, the first step in created markets is to make everyone wealthy. So that's actually the goal. So that's not exactly an appealing place to start. And the second place is intellectual property, and that I won't speak about my pay grade relative to say Priya on that issue, but that gets to the heart of trade-offs between creating incentives for innovators, but in the short run, actually leading to less inclusive outcomes. Why? Because things are more expensive, they're harder to access, they're more gated. So in that landscape where you have all of these serious trade-offs, I think it's hard to overstate the importance of public investments, and also through the channel of keeping talent. The nerdy way I would say it is through human capital development. But what does that mean? How do you create a world in which inventive, innovative, educated people want to be in Africa and work on making technology solutions there? How do you make that career and that life path sound valuable? Or in India, and I think you have to start potentially by using some stronger intervention to create stable career paths that at least are a baseline for people before the private sector emerges a little bit more organically.
Thank you, Karthik. Good thing for us, Priya has exactly the answer to that question, right, Priya?
Yeah, maybe to Karthik's point, I suppose my own diagnosis of it in terms of the state that we find ourselves in, including some of the effects that we see in African states, is that there tends to be this hyper segmentation, which probably led to hyper fragmentation. And so, you mentioned decades ago, but at least some decades ago, or at least a decade ago, we spoke about a converged regulator. And while we've moved on from the concept of a converged regulator, I think something we must bring back is that in the policy and regulatory space, we do have a convergence of interests. And we need to understand where those policy and regulatory interests do converge. So, and you asked a question about what would I say to my fellow professionals from my career path, who would be lawyers and policy advisors and so on. And I would say there can at times be a tendency to avoid concepts like accountability and transparency. And if I think about the legal community specifically, and across the different sectors, we're approaching questions in a different way, and sometimes from fear. We approach the policy and regulatory options to say, how do we avoid the obligations that come out of this? So they think about regulatory compliance as a negative word, and so when there's an obligation to, for instance, open up the data, or be more transparent, or be more accountable and demonstrate institutional structures, there's a retaliation from some of these things. But what if we looked at it differently? And what if we found a way to coalesce around these subjects to say that we actually all have an interest in, for instance, literacy or transparency? So if I'm thinking about a potential consumer down the line in this market, I would want them to have a specific level of literacy to engage in the digital economy and in the data economy. And so I also have a vested interest in something like digital literacy. And if we are all interested in the availability of a workforce with a certain level of digital skills, and how do we coalesce around that? I started off this conversation saying we find ourselves at a very crucial time, and I don't say that lightly. I think the threats to humanity, come to a specific climatic point, whether it's threats from the climate, foundations of democracy, for instance. And so there are many things that we can coalesce around. So rather than retreating into our segments and to our spaces, let's find those areas. We're here to speak about futures and what we do to enable futures. So what are those areas that we can coalesce and collaborate around across sectors and within even the public sector? So if we had to think about state institutions, how do we come together and work in a way in which we maximize the resources we have and are able to find ourselves in places with shared outcomes that are beneficial to all?
Sorry, I will just step in. Veda lost in internet connectivity. So thank you so much, Priya, and for your inputs, as well as Karthik. Mine is more just a comment from everything that you have said, from the researcher perspective, working with the people on the ground, and Karthik, your comment about having this political buy-in, and how these digital policies and tech solutions can actually be designed to address some of these unique socioeconomic challenges faced by marginal communities, both in India and in Africa. Karthik used some very good examples about the agricultural field and its importance for stakeholder engagement to drive these perspectives and the needs that are addressed at the ground level. But I think also to invest in robust digital infrastructure is very, very important. Particularly in Africa, internet connectivity is such a strain. Mobile networks, everyone owns a cell phone, but network is always a challenge, or data is always expensive. So we need to ensure, I think, together with governments, working with them to ensure this widespread access to infrastructure development. Capacity building is also, one of the important enablers for us to be effective in this digital tools and service industry, in terms of how we create these unique opportunities. And of course, not to mention, money is important. So working with the private sector to have this balance of how we can leverage both the resources, expertise, and in support of innovation. Often I'm feeling that the discussions with academics and researchers are often another language to policymakers. They are constrained with so much in terms of the development space, and we have almost more the practical responses of how we can reach out and make a difference. But again, we all reach the roadblock of finances to create sustainability. So I think mine is just, the comment on how then do we pool resources as researchers, as, to policymakers, to show that we can be relevant. And I just want to say the one last comment that the African Union Development Agency is taking a steady approach on engaging with researchers, with think tanks, with academia. Now that we have a seat at the G20, we have created a platform at the AU level, which and the African Union Development Agency is a part of. It's called the Africa Think Tank Platform, where we will be engaging with researchers to share their input and to actually accompany ministers and policymakers in these decision-making platforms, so that we want to show how evidence-based policies can be demonstrated in this area. So there is hope for the future. They have identified the value and opportunity of working with the knowledge producers. And I just wanted to share that these kind of engagements and discussions also help us to push in our respective domains to address these challenges regarding tech, regarding inclusivity of the youth, as well as engaging at the highest level of political buy-in. So Veda, I think those are not questions. It was just my comments on what I feel
Thank
from
you.
the ground. But if you want to add to that, please do. Thank you.
No, I have a rather annoying question, definitely annoying to an academic, but super fun for a policy person. If I had to ask each of you, if you had some time with policymakers in African countries or in India, right, and you had to advise them on, I mean, this is a broad, huge topic. We've talked about so many things today, so many important things. If you had to give them some real, tangible, real world, not abstract, not theoretical, not fantastical, not imaginative, real, grounded policy advice in this realm, what would that be? What would that look like?
Veda, should I go first? Yeah. I suppose I tend to feel that frustration, I suppose, that the policymaker would feel when we are presented with policy options and regulatory options with insufficient context and perhaps sometimes with insufficient categorization of the different options and so on. And so for me, the conversations I would love to have with policymakers is to use some of our evidence to show the effects of digital technology on job creation, on poverty reduction, on food security. And so to place in context, what are we dealing with in terms of the effects and the potential of this and with real use cases that could translate in their context. So that's the conversation we need to have, and then match that with policy options based on the kind of selection of effects that the particular policy maker is chasing. Pamela, to your point, we might get closer in those conversations to the regulator and the policymakers' priorities. Sometimes when given a window to engage with policymakers, we come in with, here is the framework, here is the model, and this is what we're presenting. But in fact, what we need is to have a more, have a broader discussion on it, and then try to find those relationships between those pressing priorities and the kind of situational context that policymaker and regulator finds themselves in, including their constraints and their priorities, and then from there draw out, what might be the real options to take forward. This is to say that policy and regulation cannot be a cure-all, but it is this crucial conversation at this point that we have to steer a different path, because everything suggests that we face exacerbated exclusion, and we can't allow that to happen.
Thank you, Priya. Karthik?
So you've asked an extremely challenging question, but it's the question that you have to ask. I think it's the most important thing in a dialogue like this. So I'll give one answer that I think may fairly accuse as being a cop-out, and then two that I hope are more concrete.
Okay.
One that, if it's not what I would actually tell the policymakers, what I want to tell everybody on this call would be investment in evidence-based policy making. And that I don't mean that just to kick the can down the road, that, create a framework to figure out what to do later. But actually, I think it's essential for the specific questions we've raised here. Take digital technologies, digital inclusion. Of course, these technologies are not that old, but there's a universe of claims made about, if you give people access to ID cards, payment systems, sovereignty over their own data, that it will lead to inclusive outcomes, et cetera. There's very little quantitative evidence base for exactly to what extent is this true and under what conditions are these positive outcomes more or less true, right? And what engagements with stakeholders really led to them. I think we were flying blind in terms of how to design and fine tune these policies. I think that's not good. I think it's something that, all of us from varied backgrounds can contribute towards the answer to. And I'll try to sneak in any conversation with policymakers also that it's a worthwhile ambition. But to be a little bit more concrete, I would be serious about investment in higher education under the pretense that that is not a completely obvious thing to do in countries where educational gaps, there are gaps in education at every single level in India or in Africa. And it's not obvious that marginal funds should be attributed towards the highest level of education, which targets the smallest amount of the population. But I do think in the long run, it's essential for fostering an environment of innovation and sort of making this making technological progress work in an inclusive way. And the second one, which I think could be made more concrete in specific domains, is looking for partnerships among nations in order to create more unified markets for new technology. So what I mean by that, and in some ways, I thought it was very nicely related to what Priya and Pamela were saying earlier, although I don't want to put words in your mouth, that a lot of these challenges look more insurmountable if you think of them nation by nation, because an individual country is a market that's only so big. It may have its own regulatory framework, its own hurdles, its own difficulties of doing business. I think anything that can be done to band together countries that if it doesn't look like creating a product specifically for one country would be profitable for a company, but if a union of them come together and have the common regulatory framework for, say, this payment technologies, for example, I think that's the environment in which you're most likely to get someone to create a technology that could be applicable in all markets. And again, I think like everything else, it's much easier said than done, but that's fully on the legal side and not about specific investments. So in that sense, I think it's very much worth pursuing.
Thank you, Karthik. I just want to remind our participants, and I see some people, and I'm very tempted to spotlight them, but I'm not going to. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat box. And while they do that, another follow-up I had, Karthik, especially because you mentioned investment in evidence-based policy making, and Priya, please also feel free to come in, is the fact that at CSEP, we are hoping to build an Africa research initiative, and this partnership with AU-NEPAD is part of that. So as we build a vertical that perhaps looks at technology or digital futures, for instance, what areas of research would you think would be interesting or, from an academic point of view?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating and very, very good initiative. I think everything we've talked about today about digital technologies is, I think, a really important and topical place to start, precisely because, I think there's a lot of claims, but there's not as big of an evidence base as I would like there to be. Not, of course, a lot of very careful work has been done about this, but, I think we could learn, there's a lot to learn both quantitatively and qualitatively about how digital technologies have affected people's lives in India, let's say, over the last 5 to 10 years when they've kind of most explosively grown. Even the initiatives that we kind of read about and the Indian government is most excited about, like Aadhaar ID card, banking access, digital payments. There are, obviously raw numbers about how much those are used. I think we know a little bit less about exactly how that lines up with different strata of society, kind of what is the lived experience. basically in that world of digital technology. And I think, an ambitious and extremely interesting research project is, if you compare similar studies and observations, say in India and sub-Saharan Africa, what's similar and what's different? Obviously, a lot will be different because the social makeup is extremely different, but we're also looking for and perhaps hoping for commonalities because that's, those are the things that we can drive harder on and use to foster more partnership and development. So I think digital technologies kind of strikes me as one of the most interesting areas to do further research in.
Thank you, Karthik. And I'm going to throw the example of researchers in the Amazon when asked about fieldwork. Thank you. And Priya, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, something that we're extremely fascinated with at the moment, because we have done evidence-based work around access itself and the kind of regulatory innovation in that space, is what comes next. And maybe it's, better understanding the effects of AI and its associations with development and sustainable development. But I think we're already in that space. So maybe there's also questions about after AI that fascinate us at the moment. There's a pressing question on our agenda around marginalized linguistic groups, given where we're at the moment, and kind of representation in data. There's a link that is made because this conversation has been around innovation and also around local innovation and opportunities there. There's this pressing question around the cost of regulatory uncertainty for local innovators. If I think about innovators at grand scale, they will bemoan the regulatory uncertainty challenge and what that means for them to cope in territories and where they find themselves more settled and unsettled. What does it mean to the local innovator, and how do we produce a regulatory innovation to address that challenge? How can we undo the regulatory uncertainty and regulatory complexity for the local innovator to give them the best option to in fact thrive? So there's questions there, and I suppose where we are now, where we are playing with institutional arrangements and governance arrangements, as advanced technologies come online faster and faster in a very dynamic space. We're asking questions about ethics, regulation, ethics versus regulation, the right kind of institutional makeup and oversight mechanisms. So I suppose there's questions around human oversight. What does that exactly mean, and how far does it go, and so on, and what are the effects there? So those are some of the pressing questions of our time, and we have to leverage the lessons we have because they are good, and then we have to take this agenda forward. So it's a crucial time, and the time really is now to be looking at these questions if we want to be impactful for the future.
Pamela, I cannot top that. I think that's a high note, and I think I'm going to invite you now to close, unless Karthik and Priya, if you had any closing comments. Otherwise, I'd like to invite Pamela.
Thank you, Veda. Thank you. I also was really encouraged by the knowledge sharing that was happening on this platform today, by embracing these digital policies and tech solutions that will, prioritize inclusivity. And I think that both India and Africa can unlock unprecedented opportunities in the socioeconomic growth. And as we continue having these series, I know that both India and Africa can build on the capabilities for a very futuristic technology that empowers every individual. We've heard examples, we've heard experiences, and all this will, not just help to create a product, as I said in the beginning, but will create this bridging of the divides and foster the sustainable development that we all want to see. So I just want to leave with a thank you note of the optimism that I feel by the conversations and the sharing of knowledge that we have among all of us. And even though this series didn't attract a lot of the participants, but I think the wealth and the quality of the discussion was phenomenal in terms of how we can pool our capabilities together to make sure that policy is informed and more in a tangible way that creates innovative solutions for our citizens. So I just want to say from the African Union Development Agency, from CSEP, a big thank you to Priya as well as Karthik for your time, for sharing with your experiences and your lessons learned. And all we can do is continue in the stride to shape best practices. And to Veda, thank you for pushing and pressing on this agenda. We're really grateful for your energy that you bring to this, and to the respective teams that we're working with behind the scenes to make these series possible. So just want to thank everyone, our colleague Maha on the call, who has worked in the background with the AUDA-NEPAD team, and Veda, who has worked with the CSEP team. Just want to say thank you, and we shouldn't drop the ball, but continue in the stride to elevate our voices in these pertinent topics. Thank you very much, Veda. And if you maybe want to just share when's the next series, that will be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Quick shout out, the next series will be on March 28th. We'll have the flyers and posters out soon. But again, I just want to thank Priya and Karthik and also Pamela. This has been wonderful. And I think we've really set the bar high for future conversations. We went off on completely, a lot of tangents, but I think there was a lot of depth in the conversation today. So thank you all very much and have a good evening.